My name is Cassius Peeler. I'm Director of the Real Estate Development Programs here at the School of Architecture, and I'm welcoming you to the second Tulane School of Architecture Spring Lecture for our 2020-21 series, Inhabiting the Planet. In this lecture series, we analyze and discuss the way that humans are and could be inhabiting the planet from different perspectives, and how architecture intersects with the social, racial, environmental, economic, and health issues of today. Tonight, we're joined by Daniela Rivero-Bryant for a discussion about human inhabitation and development. Tonight's lecture is also important because it's the annual Walter Wisnia Memorial Lecture. This fund was established by New Orleans architect, developer, and architecture class of '73 alumni Marcel Wisnia to honor the work and legacy of his late father, Walter Wisnia. Walter was a pioneer in the architecture and real estate development field, and we send great thanks to Marcel for his long-lasting support for this lecture series, for the School of Architecture, and especially for his role in getting the real estate development program started here as well. We're happy to have him and other members of Walter's family watching the event tonight. Since these events are virtual, we want to make them as dynamic as possible. Therefore, after her presentation, Daniela will be joined by two respondents for an interdisciplinary conversation. Those two respondents with us tonight are Richard Campanella, who's the Associate Dean for Research and a Senior Professor of Practice at the School of Architecture, and Robin Bartram, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the School of Liberal Arts at Tulane. After a discussion among the three presenters, they'll take questions from the audience. If you have questions, please type those questions into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and either the speakers or staff will read them aloud as part of that discussion. Now to introduce our main lecturer. Originally from Bolivia, Daniela Rivero-Bryant is a lecturer in the real estate development program at the Tulane School of Architecture and an industrial engineer with more than 15 years of professional experience in community development. She teaches Introduction to Real Estate at SRED 2010 in the summer and fall, so I'm pitching that for undergraduates in the audience, but also teaches in the graduate real estate program as well. Her professional work began in the city of El Alto, Bolivia, one of the poorest urban areas in Latin America. As a young engineering student, participating in efforts and policy around creating improved quality of life and health, and working closely with multiple levels of government, that shaped her appreciation of cities' issues and how to attack them, how to address them. While in El Alto, she also met many indigenous leaders. Sorry, I said I was signed out. Apologies. She met many indigenous leaders, including ex-Bolivian President Evo Morales, with whom Daniela served as his chief of staff when he was elected president in 2006. Daniela arrived in New Orleans right after Katrina, where she invested 10 years of work in the post-Katrina New Orleans recovery. Her efforts as a field operations director and later as executive director of the nonprofit Rebuilding Together resulted in the reconstruction of over 1,000 homes in the city's most vulnerable communities. Daniela later became a member of the Louisiana Land Trust executive team, where she coordinated the statewide disposition and reuse of thousands of Katrina-damaged properties with statewide community leaders and governments. These experiences helped to shape her doctoral research, which focused on how community residents and political leaders make decisions and evolve after natural disasters, including how this environment fosters civic leadership that can turn into political action, the kind of action that treats local knowledge and networks as a professional expertise on par with more traditional or credentialed disciplines. In addition to today, Daniela has served on a number of nonprofit organization boards from the New Orleans Public Belt Railroad to the Algiers Development District, where she's currently a commissioner. Daniela lives in Algiers Point with her family, where they enjoy visits to the French Quarter, great food, and live music. And Daniela has lived and worked in a number of countries in Europe, Latin America, and Africa, and is fluent in 4 languages, as well as some softwares I've never heard of. But please join me in welcoming Professor Daniela Rivero-Bryant.
Thank you, Cassius, and thanks to everybody that is joining us tonight. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. I also want to thank Kristen Jones from the School of Architecture, who actually worked to put together these lectures. And today I want to share with you this issue of amenity communities and how people are migrating. I think we've all seen a lot of the changes in life that COVID has brought on, but I do think that this is one of the more interesting ones and that really calls for attention, and we'll discuss why. So today I will go over just the introduction and relevant. I will define amenity communities and also what their pull factors are, the things pulling people into these communities, whether this problem is unique, um, and development challenges or development opportunities that these communities will face. And later, after that, we'll have the responses from my two wonderful panelists or respondents, Rich Campanella and Robin Bartram, who I'm also tremendously honored to be joined by. Thank you guys so much for being here. And we'll also answer questions from the audience. So we all know this guy, I think, and the coronavirus. I'm going to look at two specific things. First, the coronavirus has created this social distance society, and through these different policies that local governments are putting in place to avoid the spread of the virus, social distance, quarantines, etc.
Daniela, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I don't think your slides are moving.
My slides are not moving. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Just a second. Okay, how about now? Do you see them? So I was talking about the coronavirus creating these issues of social distance, and of course the quarantines. I'm just going to put Q here. This is not referred to QAnon, just to the quarantines, and which have definitely increased our preference for space. We have an increased need for space in our lives, bigger homes, exterior spaces, parks, etc., that we can use while we cannot use the regular amenities that call people to cities like the theater, the arts, culture, restaurants, etc. So we have this need for space. I am an economist, so I must show you a little bit of this. This need for space has fueled the demand, of course, for bigger houses. And at the same time, it has increased housing prices in the areas where people want to move to. On the other hand, we also have coronavirus really has um, accelerated the advent of telecommuting as a real way to work. I think before coronavirus, we all thought a little bit about telecommuting as a perhaps an option for work, but it wasn't quite taken as seriously in terms of productivity, etc. However, with the coronavirus, and we've all sort of gotten, hence we are here, we've all sort of gotten pulled into this telecommuting world. Those of us who can, I must say with a caveat, especially white collar workers, people in offices who can telecommute, who normally work with computers. And this advent of telecommuting has really disrupted the differences or the trade off that we have to make as workers between being close to your location and to your work location, and how long you want to drive. So we have, for one, the cost of commuting, the price of commuting has gone down significantly, right? I'm not commuting anymore. So for me, I can go to work anywhere around the country or the world, and I can still join you through Zoom or through any telecommuting software. And so since the price for commuting has decreased, there's an increase in distance from work that allows us to no longer take into consideration that transportation cost and time. So these two, both the need for space, creating a higher demand for housing on one side, and then on the other side, this automatic price zero of commuting are going to create some results. And I think we have seen this. I'm sure that I'm getting all this news in my Facebook and in my my social media because of the artificial intelligence. They know what I'm looking at, but at least I've been flooded by articles and papers on where are people going. People are leaving cities, and there we have a lot of theories on where people are going to move to. I'm sure this has been something also in your mind. And the question is, of course, where are people moving to, right? There are, I would say, three main destinations that people are deciding to move to. Some, and I would say the easiest ones, are suburbs, right? We see people moving from the main city to suburbs where they can have more space. The other one are people moving to smaller cities, people moving from New York and some of the coast to smaller cities, of course, including New Orleans, that have the level of infrastructure necessary to telecommute, but also to live a life with a family and still enjoy some city amenities during COVID. And the last place that I would like, and this is really the place that I want to discuss, are amenity communities. So we have some indication from the market about how things are changing in the US. But considering that housing prices don't move as fast as people, I think we need to look at some of this information with a little bit of a grain of salt. So this figure here shows the percent change in housing price index, the seasonally adjusted housing price index between the third quarter of 2019 and the third quarter of 2020, which is when I'm assuming that people are really starting to move after the pandemic, when we've spent the summer, all of us were kind of at the beginning shocked and expecting that things were going to go back to normal faster than they did or than they have. And so a lot of people are moving. Now, if you have people leaving a city and coming to another city, we should see a push on the demand for housing in the cities where people are moving to. This map shows us the changing housing price index, and the way to see this map is the colder colors, the blue and the lighter green, the darker green, I'm sorry, are going to reflect places where where housing prices have actually gone down since between the third quarter of 19 and the third quarter of 2020, which is the latest house pricing data that we have available. So you can see that some of these areas like the Bay Area and San Francisco have had a tremendous plunge, almost a change of 8 percentage points in housing prices. You can also see this area around Oklahoma. And interestingly, most of the country is sort of above this threshold where you see the darker green and or the lighter green and towards the yellow and red is where prices actually either held up or continued growing. Now, I'm going to focus, given that this doesn't give us a tremendous amount of information looking at just changes in the housing price index, I'm going to focus specifically in this area, the western part of the country. And the reason why I'm looking at this area is that this area has a tremendous amount of national parks, which are natural amenities, and they were already experiencing a housing or a population growth before COVID, which had been flagged by some scientists. So you can see I am not as amazing a mapper as Rich Campanella. So with my limited mapping capabilities, I created this map showing you sort of the changes as well as where the national parks are. Here you have, for example, the Joshua Tree area. In the Washington area also, they've had significant increases in their housing price index. Anywhere here where you see this are areas that have significantly increased their housing price index. But I do think that another issue for these communities is that in general, they're very small. So let me just define these amenity communities. So we're going to be talking about a lot of the communities around these national parks. So an amenity community is going to be a city or a town situated 1 mile from a national park, at least 25 miles away from an urban center, and with a population of under 25,000. Stoker and his colleagues in a recent article that they published identify about 1,500 amenity communities in this area that you can see, and they are specifically not on the coast. We're not talking about coastal communities. Coastal communities also have a different set of amenities that they can offer residents. So it is not surprising that throughout all the coasts, prices having really plunged because, of course, a lot of people still want to live there. But these communities are going to be on average population 2,000. They're very small towns. The per capita income, the median is $25,000 a year, or well, let's say $26,000. This means that half the population has an income lower than 26,000 and half the population's income is higher. The median rent is $810 a month. Housing values are also relatively low. They are around 191,000 for the median again. And the interesting thing, I think, is that they've had a population growth rate of 6.8% even before COVID. Just for reference, New Orleans in the last 5 years experienced a 0.1% population growth. We experienced this level of growth in the years after Katrina, 2007, 2008, 2009, when we had a lot of people moving back. So a 6.8% growth is really big when we're talking about increases in population. Now, of course, I explained why people are moving away from cities, and I'm sure you're thinking about that too, especially, like I said, if you can work from home. And now I want to tell you just a little bit about why people decide to move to these amenity communities. And it really is the access to natural amenities. They are close to natural parks. Also, the cost of living is relatively low when compared to the cost of living in cities. So people are coming in with city salaries, and they are living in sort of an urban, in sort of a rural community where they can, of course, have a much nicer quality of life. And as well, we have available land and high-end housing in these communities because of the high tourism that they had before. Now, you may ask, well, if they've been having this increased tourism and a population growth before COVID, are these challenges new? And they are not necessarily new challenges, but population growth will continue to increase with telecommuting, especially as more of us become more comfortable and employers agree to pay you a little bit less so that you can live wherever you want and telecommute. Um, and so I do think that there will be an increase in these push factors, or sorry, in these pull factors, in an increase in the population that is less than manageable for some of these communities. Also, they have little planning tools. These are small towns that, and a lot of them don't even have a full-time mayor at the city. So you have to imagine that the challenge, which I'm going to talk about a little in a little bit, is more of a city challenge where we're more used to planning and zoning and using a lot of the policy tools that we have in government, while in rural areas they have, this becomes more of an issue. They just don't have the planning tools, they don't have the planning staff, and like I said, they don't even have a lot of huge government capacity. Also, the permanent remote workers are not equal to second homeowners and tourists because they are, like I said, permanent. Tourists and second homeowners increase the demands on housing, especially short-term housing, and the amount of people that come in to work seasonally in these communities. They create some externalities, some spillovers for adjacent little towns that are receiving some of the spillovers of these tourists or of these workers when there's no available housing in the area where people want to be. But permanent remote workers are there to stay. They're going to require an infrastructure. They're going to require, they come in with money to spend. And so that is going to create a few challenges. One of the things that I wanted to show you here is these are the housing, I mapped the housing price index since 1995, which is when we start with this index in these Western states. And you can see that as time passes, we really have a just sort of a increasing trend in prices until, of course, everything crashes in 2008, right? You can see market prices coming down, and an increasing trend that is actually higher or even similar than the trends that were occurring before the crash in 2008, before the financial crisis. Now, here I'm showing you the housing price index between 2015 and 2020, so that you can see this piece is really this little piece of the map. So you can see that in general, while the price, if the price was 100 for a house or $100,000 in 95, any given one of these lines can tell you how much the price increased across the years. So you have some communities where you can see the pricing index was relatively stable and low. And of course, other communities in cities where the housing price index was much higher. And these are the, this specific one is San Francisco, where the pricing house index, meaning housing prices had quintupled almost between 95 and 2019, 2018. And then they start to fall, but the big fall comes here during the coronavirus. So I actually thought about looking at this from a trends perspective. And let me explain what this is going to show you. If you map the housing price index in time, right, we will have some sort of upward sloping line until the time where I am measuring the 2020 Q3 change. So I'm looking at whether this slope here before coronavirus changed upward, meaning that the housing prices are increasing in an increasing fashion, or changed downwards, meaning housing prices actually lost. And what I'm mapping here is are the results. So basically, in the areas that you see that are red, housing prices stayed the same or increased up to fourfold in some of these zip codes, especially the darker ones. This is not a coincidence, since right in these areas are several national parks, right? You have Joshua Tree in this area. Here in this, you have all of these Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho areas that are increasing in price. And then you have this area in Washington state where a lot of people were saying, oh my gosh, there's a tremendous amount of Zoom towns showing up in Washington state where people are moving to be close to national parks. However, these areas were already areas where people were moving to. So these areas where population growth was already increasing before COVID. So they actually haven't experienced that much of a trend, of a change in the trends. Instead, they are actually a little bit lower. The prices have actually dropped a little bit compared in these zip codes compared to 2019. And speaking of this being a new sort of challenge, I found this interesting chart about what the growth concerns prior to COVID were for local officials in these amenity communities. And the idea here is that this, we have these sort of circles that are going to show you how much people rated each concern based on how much their community had grown. So, for example, the lighter lines are for negative growth, then a little darker for very little growth, and the darkest ones are the communities that had high growth. You can see that one of the major concerns is housing affordability. Also, the differences between wages to cost of living, needing more resources, meaning resources to plan, but also infrastructure resources and funding to create these affordable housing programs, etc. And income inequality is one of the problems also that was at the top of people's minds. Besides that, of course, traffic is an issue, parking, the population growth itself is an issue. Interestingly, they talk a lot about too much tourism. In New Orleans, we know a little bit about that. These communities have, just like many of us, a love-hate relationship with tourism. They get a lot of tourists in the high season. There's a lot of congestion. There's a lot of, everything is packed. For the people who are the locals, of course, there is a benefit because tourism brings jobs and money, etc. But also they can kind of get sick of that. However, for the planners or for the town officials, that's not as big a problem. Now, like I said, some of these development challenges are going to include that these towns have a limited government capacity. This increasing growth due to telecommuting will continue to push prices up, housing prices up. and also will encourage developers to invest. So the fact that there may be some money coming in for development, I think creates more of a development opportunity. But I'm going to talk about that in my next slide. And also, telecommuting may lead to increasing income inequality, mainly because you have people, like I said, moving in with city salaries in areas that are relatively low income. So that creates a mass of people at the upper end of the income distribution that is disbalanced with the people at the lower end of the income distribution, who are the locals. Of course, you also have environmental degradation risk, and there is always the issue of who are the newcomers and do their politics mesh with the politics and the desires of the locals. And finally, I do think that there are many opportunities in this case. Being aware of the problem should encourage us to involve these communities in planning their own future now, and especially leading to sustainable growth. They can decide what areas to develop, etc., and that should be done in a organized way that doesn't occur after all the changes have happened. Also, I think there's an important point to foster a cross-town collaboration here, because the towns are so small that they can benefit from economies of scale from having, for example, a regional planning commission or something like that, where everybody can pitch in, but you don't have to have that staff or those elected officials just for one town. Also, regional partnerships to develop, to foster sustainable growth. And they also have this is a good moment that could be seized to establish some affordable housing finance mechanisms. You have a lot of people coming in, so there can be taxes and other mechanisms from local governments that can, on one side, disincentivize the migration, a snowball of migration, but also help people understand how them coming in affects the community and what kind of down payment, so to speak, should be made. And finally, I do think that since newcomers, and I'm talking about newcomers in a very general way, value this outdoor space, or people coming from cities, this is also an important moment to engage them in environmental stewardship and community development, to integrate them into the community and for them to understand how these resources should be used. And in general, I would say this is a call for greater attention to these amenity communities that are in need of a lot of planning, a lot of just sitting down and sketching solutions and issues that they are confronting right now. So that is the presentation I had for today. And now I'd love to invite Robin Bartram and Rich Campanella to respond, to comment. Robin, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to. So first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here, Daniela. You can hear me okay, right? Yeah, okay, wonderful. So in thinking about this topic, my mind went to studies that I'm familiar with, so mostly from urban sociologists, of somewhat similar processes, but in other contexts. So I'm going to use this time to briefly mention some of these studies and then try and consider how they might contribute to our understanding of this kind of contemporary phenomena in this particular context. So broadly speaking, the studies that that come to my mind are of gentrification and displacement in US cities. And I think they provide a few angles from which to approach some of the questions Daniela raises specifically in those last couple of slides. So scholarship on gentrification began by assuming that most, if not all, newcomers to city neighborhoods were urban pioneers. This is kind of newcomers who tended to be middle class or upper class, upwardly mobile and white, spatially and symbolically kind of bounded themselves off from existing residents. And the general assumption here was that these people, first of all, cared little about the existing residents, and two, that their arrival led to residential and cultural displacement of existing residents who, because of histories of discrimination, extraction, and exploitation, tended to be low-income people of color. So obviously there's a different context from the amenity communities, although I think that kind of begs important questions about the extent to which we can compare and contrast some of these conditions. So that was the kind of beginning, early understanding of gentrification and the players involved and the implications. Then came more attention to nuances among newcomers. So especially attention to the kinds of people that sociologist Japonica Brown-Saraceno calls social preservationists. And these are newcomers to areas who seek to preserve the ways of life of existing residents and to mitigate the negative effects of their arrival. So they're very kind of aware of their different status in terms of income usually, and also in terms of race and ethnicity when they arrive, when they move to these new places. And I should note, importantly, that Brown-Saraceno uncovers this tendency, uncovers this social preservationists among newcomers, both in urban and non-urban contexts. So she has a book about 2 Chicago neighborhoods and 2 New England towns. So this isn't just an urban thing. Again, I think we could ask important questions about how these contexts are different and similar to amenity communities, but it isn't just an urban story. So then this kind of makes me wonder, what kind of newcomers might we find in these amenity communities? So they clearly, or at least Daniela's suggesting, that they value the natural environment. I think that gentrification scholars would remind us that newcomers to urban areas value certain things about cities too, perhaps in similar ways. So they're valuing whether it's historic buildings or certain aesthetics of downtown neighborhoods. So are newcomers in amenity communities more likely to be pioneers or social preservationists? Perhaps something in between. And if we can assume or even hope that they are more akin to social preservationists, how can this be harnessed to mitigate the negative effects of their arrival? So I think this relates very clearly to one of Daniela's last points, that amenity communities have little regulatory or kind of planning government capacity to deal with changes. So the logical answer might be to build, create more public power, more public capacity, planning, zoning, et cetera, But existing literature on gentrification also highlights the capacity and tendency of affluent newcomers to kind of control and shape, dictate land use policies and align local governments with their own interests. So efforts to increase regulations, for example, I think this suggests would need to ensure that existing residents had a voice, a loud voice in these processes, and not that we don't just hear the voices of the incomers whose arrival may coincide and indeed necessitate new forms or the new breadth of government. So I think this leads me to a couple of questions that I don't know if Daniela, you have the answers to, but I think they're important questions. The first is, what do we know about the demographics of these incomers? So aside from their income and how that contrasts to existing residents, what about race, ethnicity, for example? There is a sociologist called Megan Steinman who is working on a book about second homeowners. And she points to really important differences in the ages of people, of second homeowners, and the extent to which they commit or invest in the communities where they have second homes. So age could be an important factor here too. My second question is whether or not the problem is the incomers or just the lack of regulation or resources in the first place. And I guess I'll just end by saying that I've mentioned a couple of concepts and studies that I think hopefully might shed light on contemporary moves to amenity communities. But I do think it's really critical to really carefully consider that how applicable these theories are to this new context. And maybe trying to kind of parse out the differences and the similarities and the conditions under which different things occur could also shed light on issues of displacement in the kind of regular kind of cities and contexts that we tend to study as well.
Thank you, Robin. I do love the analogy to gentrification as the move to these communities. And I definitely agree that there's going to be much more that we need to know about who's moving, why are they moving. Now, considering your first question of who is moving, before the pandemic, it appears that more of the people moving there were like I was saying, the second homeowners, although they were not moving as permanent residents. And those people are older, have more wealth, and also, of course, tend to be on the wider end. However, that already had caused trouble because these homes it's kind of like what we experience here with Airbnb New Orleans, right? You have areas that are controlled by these short-term rentals where really nice properties are used and then they're empty for half the year. And regarding the permanent newcomers, that is a little bit different. We don't have, unfortunately, the data is not keeping up as fast as we need. I'd love to see some more demographic data on who moved last year. But from what we know so far, a lot of people from the tech industry were the first ones to leave. And I also think these Western gateway communities or amenity communities, the proximity that they have to California, Washington, Texas on the bottom, these are huge states, especially California and Texas. So even if you have a small amount of people leaving to areas that are in the mountain range closer to their states, that's a big influx. But it was seen at the beginning, just from news and anecdotal information, that the tech industry was the first one moving, no? The end of Silicon Valley and all these things. So these are much younger people. And like you said, I'm afraid, I don't know if they are going to be more of the social preservationist type, or, if I had been in my 20s, and you just think you're coming to paradise and you can do whatever you want, and this is now your space. So that's why I also see a big challenge with the politics of people. The newcomers being, the locals being a little more politically conservative, and the newcomers being much more liberal, and that can definitely lead to clashes at many levels. Yeah. Rich, would you like to?
Yeah, but when I first saw you were speaking on amenity communities in scenic areas, the set of communities that came to my mind were like Stanley, Idaho, Jackson Hole, Wyoming, Aspen, Colorado, Estes Park, Taos, New Mexico, Park City, Utah. But upon seeing your definition and then that gray map with the thousands of points and that the average population was only 2,000, it sounds like you're really not talking about those two communities. You're talking about much smaller, lesser known towns that are seeing these surges. Can you clarify?
I think they're both. I think the towns, well, we have to define and somehow to stop somewhere with the towns. But in general, they have populations under 25,000. So a little bit bigger areas might still qualify. But the main thing that I would say represents these towns is more their closeness to national parks and them being further away from cities.
Well,
more-
on that note, I had a follow-up question regarding the national parks and monuments and the 1 mile buffer, which brings out the GIS guy in me. Of all of our beautiful Western wildlands, it's really a tiny percentage that is a national park or a national monument. There's lots of beautiful areas that are national forests and wilderness areas. And if you look at your map that showed southern and central Idaho, all really booming, I don't think there's a single national park in Idaho. There's Craters of the Moon National Monument, but there's still beautiful land. And so I wonder if those criteria are actually overly stringent and almost arbitrary. Now, true, our crown jewels tend to be the most famous Yellowstone Glacier, but there's also many other areas that are also attracting this phenomena that I think are slipping through your net there. Relatedly, the 1 mile buffer, you know, some of these Rocky Mountain areas, people drive 70 miles to go to dinner. So 1 mile is really, really close to a fairly rare phenomena. And I wonder if you expand both of those to include maybe ski resort towns, scenic college towns, Bozeman, Montana, that you'll be casting a wider net.
You're absolutely right. And if that, you know, thinking of that, how you have several national forests. I should have put national forests there as well. But yeah, these are areas, towns that are close to these natural amenities in the West. So I would say you're absolutely determine who's going to be in the list and who's going to be out of the list. But I agree that, I mean, I would even say most of these communities, if they're not cities or urban areas, would be considered these Western amenity communities. I don't know if we want to have any questions from the audience or
there is a question from an attendee here. And this person wonders where the people are moving from. Are they from all over, disproportionately from certain areas?
yeah, well, I think in this, like I said, we don't have the migration information yet since COVID started. But I do think a lot of people are moving from those big states. California is a big one. Of course, on the east side too, there are people that are going to move closer to these national parks, but we don't have the exact information on that yet. I also, sorry.
I was wondering if you could make use of the county inflow and outflow data from the census. I think the American Community Survey estimates that every 2 years, and you'd be able to at least see from which county they're coming and arriving to a county. Now, beyond that, who the demographics are, you know, are they empty nesters? Are they young professionals that would require other methods?
Yeah, I agree. I do think that's a good, the county inflow outflow data is great as long as we have it. So for 2020, I'm not sure when the ACS, I think we have the latest ACS we have is the American Community Service 2018 right now that was published. Trust me, I've been looking for this data everywhere, or you know, ways to figure this out, and just kind of because of this big question, you know, where are people moving? And actually, there is a question here: are these trends sustainable? Doesn't all this go away once everyone has the COVID vaccine? And I do think there is some seasonality to this due to COVID. However, I think with telecommuting, a lot of white collar workers this trend will stay. In fact, today I was reading an article in the New York Times. They had a survey of homeowners who had moved during COVID, asking them, do you plan on going back to your original state or county? And about 1 in 3 of telecommuters say they don't want to move back. So I think that's a great question, whether the vaccine will change, will give us a way back. I do think cities in general have too many advantages to die. I don't think it's the end of density or anything like that. But we're talking about small towns. So even if 1,000 people move there, it makes a huge difference for them. Rich or Robin, do you have any comments on that? What do you think?
I mean, it strikes me as isn't just about vaccines and the choice of those people who've moved, but also employment patterns and employers and what the decisions that they make about returning to physical work or not.
That's true. That's a great point. And there's another question, and aren't these trends just relatively minor adjustments to previous trends? And actually, one of my maps where I was showing you the changes in the trend, I thought that was the more important, the more important piece is that a lot of these areas have had increases in population already before COVID. So this was a problem for them before. I actually got interested in this, reading some papers from just last year about the pre-COVID issues. So I don't know. I don't think these are minor adjustments for these communities. I think a lot of people have definitely, especially if they can telecommute, will have a lot of changed preferences for outdoor space, for more land, especially younger people.
There's a question here about happening in other regions, and the first thing that popped to my mind was the entire state of Vermont.
Yes. It's also happening on the east side, on the eastern side of the country. Yes. However, the density of these national parks and these natural areas is not as big. We have more densely populated areas there in the eastern part of the country than in the western part. So I don't think it's just sort of I do think that it's in the eastern part of the country, the moves are more to suburbs because we have suburbs there. I think in the western part of the country, the move to more rural communities is a little bit stronger than in the east.
I'm also curious whether people who grew up in rural communities are opting to stay there more than they were before. So whether it's just kind of people moving from cities, whether it's kind of getting out of the city, or whether it's just more of a general trend preference for living in these places, whether it's staying in these places or moving to them.
That's a great question. I think one of the issues that these communities have had traditionally is their economy works based on tourism, and these tourism industries are mostly lifted by the people who have low education levels, who make low wages. And I think that's why people have been leaving these communities in general. Now, with the advent of these newcomers, it's going to also be interesting to see if there are any spillovers from this new. Let's say Daniela moves to, I don't know, close to Redbird, Idaho, and I'm teaching, and I may need somebody to help me with some of my work. Perhaps that will create some new jobs in these communities that will act as a pull factor for locals. But I do think the concern is that there will be a much larger income inequality building there. And, you know, people, let's say if I were to move, I would probably be getting, perhaps hiring somebody to help me with my children, or so it would still be more in that service industry bracket, more than in the professional bracket. So I do think that there's another opportunity there to create some professional programs that can act as complements to this inflow of migration.
There's a question here about political shifts of coastal blue creeping into interior red. Any thoughts on that, and perhaps the extent to which precinct level voting data might shed light on this?
That's a great idea. Yeah, that's a very big question. How these how will the politics change? The rural Western communities might end up being bluer and bluer. However, like I said, I think we're going to see more and more in the next few years, and that's a great question to research with data coming out from the next election or so. You know, how are these trends changing in terms of politics, and also just in terms of community leadership? Will people coming in displace local, like Robin was saying, local homeowners and residents because they have more buying power, and you know, they can develop land. Of course, this is also a pull for developers, right? We see the higher demand for housing, and developers will also come in, and that creates another sort of political problem. As a developer, you do need some level of political connection with the authorities, etc., to be able to push your work forward. And that might be another, you know, that might be another issue in the politics that will create a problem. I'm going to read a question. I also understand that short-term rental companies like Airbnb are seeking increases in the average length of stays, presumably because people can travel for 10 days now and still go to work or school. And are some of these amenity communities likely to attract long-term seasonal residents who might just have been out tourists before? That's a great question. And actually, there is some evidence that before COVID, the people who were moving there were the people who had stayed as medium, maybe I should tell medium-term residents, not permanent residents, but more of in a tourist status, but still living there for longer time. And that's also another thing that might exacerbate these housing markets, how needy these housing markets are, because again, the more people even stay, if they stay short-term or long-term, will put some pressure on the housing market in these communities, which is fragile. It's not a very stable and robust housing market like we have in cities. And I think that's the main issue with these communities, is that a lot of these issues of housing affordability, traffic, are big city issues. They're not used to dealing with these types of issues, and they don't even have the capacity, the government capacity to deal with these issues.
I quite like this question from the Q&A. Could we associate these trends of movement with a greater interest in ecological preservation? Or on the contrary, could we see this as more harmful for these relatively preserved landscapes? So what is the impact of some of these national parks and forests on this group of people who are coming, if we know?
That's also an important issue, the issue of environmental impact. And you know, there are risks when cities grow or when towns grow. There are risks into encroaching in some of these national parks. Some of the publicly owned lands might become private. in some of these cases. And I do think that perhaps we need to have a survey of who moved there and what they think. But this is just from what I think about these people that moved there, that there is an increased environmental awareness from people moving there, because there's a selection process, right? I want to be close to a certain area because I might love the outdoors, I might love the mountains, or whatever amenity I'm going after. And I do think that's why there is an important opportunity here to engage people who are interested in preserving, who would be more like Robin called them, the social preservationists. I think it's important to identify the social preservationists and build on them too. Bring them in, get them on board with what the community wants, and help them or involve them to overcome these issues.
Can I ask a quick question, Daniela, about this? Is the date, I mean, do we know that these incomers do value or respect the environment? I mean, are we assuming this is a reason for them moving to these places versus cheaper property prices and higher return, etc.?
Yeah, well, there is no information on that, on their specific reasons yet. I think the main reason for the move, like I said, has been COVID and all these social distancing needs. I think a lot of the people that moved there are people who went on vacation and fell in love with the place and wish they could live in a little town like this. If only I could get a job here. And now they have that, right? They have that ability to commute remotely. A lot of these towns do have high-speed internet. That was another one of the questions in the Q&A. So they have the ability, they give people the ability to work well from home. But yeah, I think the environmental risk is very high, and we don't know yet who is, what their desires are in terms, or what their preferences are for the newcomers in terms of, are they moving there for environmental reasons, or are they, for environmental preferences maybe, or is it more the factors of quality of life, which is involved, which is which is linked to of course the natural amenity and lower property prices as well.
Mm-hmm. I also think there's some useful perhaps insight again from gentrification scholarship that points to the kind of how people with more resources, more kind of clout, get to exert their particular way of valuing environment. So in the context of gentrification, usually it's kind of the built environment of kind of historic architecture and kind of asserting its claim to space because they understand it and want to preserve it. And so I wonder if there's similarities here as well in the different kinds of ways that different people of different resources get to assert their definition of value of the natural environment.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is a lot of that.
Daniela, if you were to do a qualitative study involving interviews and getting to know the people, what three ideal amenity communities would frame out a really good study area?
That's a great question. I think I would definitely at least start working in the region, well, the Yellowstone area, communities are around Yellowstone, small ones like, towns close to Idaho Falls. I think would be, if I only could pick three, that's a hard choice. I would definitely also pick some that are close to the California area, the Fort Rock, and maybe I would pick one in close to Colorado, like Sandy Lakes. So smaller communities to really see where, who's there, who's new, and what's happening. I think we are almost, oh, well, there is I see another question, but it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. Oh, are these areas low or no income tax? Could people be moving for a perceived better deal on taxes? And the person said, specifically thinking of Silicon Valley types. And yeah, well, I do think those are some of the, I don't know, I haven't looked at the income. That's a great question, the income taxes. Although those are more at the state level, cities usually are charging property taxes and sales taxes. So income taxes might be part of the equation for sure. There's another one, let me see. Consider a place like Sedona, Arizona. There has been very significant growth over the last 20 years, which was significant, which was evident to me. The resulting urbanization has resulted in restrictions of who can access the nature trails and amenities. The impact is to restrict neighborhoods, which both protect natural resources but create inequality. And have we looked at those types of communities? Yeah, that's one of the major challenges in analyzing these communities. And I think this is also why we need more planning and more, they need more support from more of a regional perspective, really in order to deal with the income inequality that this will cause. Because I think it's going to be very clear and very segregated too as these communities grow, where the wealthier and the newer people are, also due to new developments, etc., and where the locals or the lower income people are.
For one last question, we have one, let's see. As you said, even a sudden influx of 1,000 people can dramatically change a community in regards to demand for resources. So I guess to end, what lessons do you think can be made from what you've studied and what you learned, and how can it be applied to the future development of these and similar types of communities?
I think some of the important things to consider here are, if you want to move to these communities, you should definitely try to join, how do I say this, to join in a sort of life that reflects more the local life and not reproduce your city life. And from the perspective of planning and development, I do also think that there are important opportunities right now for people to plan these communities better. In many cases, these communities kind of are settled in an organic way, close to the parks and all that, and have not been planned much. But this push definitely is creating the need for planning. And I do think the most important, although these communities like, according to some of the research that I've read, homeowners in these communities like this sense of small townness. And that kind of creates a problem with the regional work, right? Because people want to just be in their own community and not deal with people outside of it. But I do think the most important opportunity there is for regional work around the parks, and regional work with communities, especially the ones that have experienced the least growth so far, where they have similar issues and similar not shortcomings, but similar, I guess, needs of for more robust government and planning.
Great. Thank you for this conversation. I think I was thinking the closest I've ever felt to nature was on Mardi Gras Day in New Orleans. So I can't move to Wyoming, but we'll have to watch these trends over time. Certainly, it's early. And thank you for your insights, Daniela, Professor Rivero-Bryant. Thank Professor Campanella and Professor Bartram for your conversation this evening as well. And I want to recognize again the legacy of Walter Wisnia, who was again a pioneer in architecture and real estate development. While I didn't personally know Walter, of course, clearly he was ahead of his time, and this lecture is a tribute to his work and his innovation. So I want to thank all of you who joined the Walter Wisnia Memorial Lecture tonight, and invite you to join us again in a few weeks on Monday, March 1st at the same time, 5:15 p.m. Central Time. We'll welcome back Tulane alumna Sarah Jensen Carr for a conversation about human inhabitation and health. Thank you.